students. Today we are back as we are exploring vertebrates this week, so I hope you have backbone enough to continue with our lesson today. Yesterday, if you recall, we gave some characteristics of ectotherms and endotherms. So before we begin, quick review. Can anyone tell me what is an ectotherm? Okay, I hope you said otherwise known as cold-blooded or outside temperature. Body temperature is regulated by outside temperature. And how about an endotherm? Okay, also known as warm-blooded, and these are organisms that regulate their body temperature internally, inside temperature, endotherm. Well, as I mentioned at the end of the period yesterday, today we are going to begin with fish. So let's get there. Make sure your books are open and we are ready to go as we explore today's continuing lesson on vertebrates with fishies. So let's begin with fish. And I'm just looking for something here. I found it. All right, misplaced. I'm using a little clicker now to change the slides, and I dropped it. I didn't see where it was. All right, so what are fish? By the way, one of our activities later this week is going to be dealing with fish, and so we'll get to that on Thursday. But for now, fish are water-dwelling, which means they simply live in the water, vertebrates that have three basic characteristics. So whether we're talking about freshwater fish or saltwater fish, no matter what kind of fish, all fish have three basic characteristics, and they have scales, they have fins, and they have gills. So if we look at this diagram here, we can see the scales are those structures on the outside of the fish, kind of like our skin. The fins are the structures that help steer the fish and propel the fish, kind of like our limbs. And the gills, as we mentioned yesterday, gills are the structures that enable fish in particular, but other organisms as well, breathe underwater or remove the dissolved oxygen from the water in order to breathe. They are analogous to our lungs. So all fish have those three characteristics. That's what they have in common. But as you can imagine, not all fish are the same. And so there are different groups or categories of fish as well. So let's go over those three main groups of fish. And we'll start with the most primitive ones, or those with the simplest of structures. And they are called the jawless fish. The jawless fish. The jawless fish, as the name implies, they lack jaws. They do not have jaws. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen the famous movie Jaws and its many sequels, but imagine if the movie were called Jawless. I wonder if it would have had the same impact. And having the main character of the movie a lamprey or a hagfish that looked like this. You know, basically the worst thing that could happen to you. Well, actually, let's think about this for a moment. Imagine if there was a scary movie called Jawless. Do you know what could potentially happen with lamprey and hagfish if they started to attack humans? Oh my goodness, you would have really nasty hickeys. Do you know what a hickey is? Oh, if you don't, I'm not going to tell you. But imagine this. Lamprey and hagfish eat by attaching themselves on their food source and then sucking the material as hard as they can into their bodies. So imagine that. Lamprey and hagfish in this movie would be going around kissing people. Interesting movie. Well, I do have a story about lamprey, by the way. Our township where we live is right along the Delaware River. And the Delaware River is a famous river in American history, not the least of which was the crossing of the Delaware by George Washington and his troops across the icy Delaware back on Christmas Eve in the 18th century during the Revolutionary War to defeat the British and the Hessian soldiers that were partying up that night in Trenton. But around that time frame, both before and after, in fact, throughout the 18th century right into the 19th century, there was an industry called timber rafting. And timber rafting was an industry that enabled many of the ships in our country to be built in the early days. Most of our naval fleet, when we had sailing vessels, were built in seaports near the sea, but they got the wood from very far upstream in undisturbed virgin forests of tall white pine trees and other types of trees as well. But these trees would be logged, and this is long before the day of the internal combustion engine and tractor trailers to transport these trees. The only means of transportation was to get these logs and tie them into gigantic rafts and float them down the river. The Delaware River was famous for this. The Susquehanna River was also known for it. But on the Delaware River, each spring, these timber raftsmen would tie together these incredibly long logs from these nice long trees into giant rafts that could be longer than 100 feet long and 50 feet wide. We're talking huge rafts, much bigger than the log raft in Tom Sawyer in that story. And it would take several days to float these rafts downstream. So these timber raftsmen would basically live or camp out on the rafts on their journey down to the seaports in Camden or Philadelphia and other such places south or downstream of Trenton, New Jersey. And while they were there, camping out and trying to navigate the treacherous rapids in different parts of the Delaware River, like the most treacherous part was a place called Foul Rift, bordering White Township, New Jersey, near Belvedere. And this was the most dangerous part of their entire journey. Anyway, they would fish along the way, and one of the food sources that they would use were lamprey fish. You see, these lamprey would be attracted to the fresh sap on the trees of these rafts, and they would all attach themselves. They would start sucking the sap out of the trees. And the timber raftsmen knew this, and they would reach down and grab a hold of these slimy looking fish without jaws, grab a hold of their tails, and chop their heads off with a knife. And then they'd take the body and fillet them and cook them over a fire on the raft, and they'd snack on these, delightful treats. It doesn't sound too appetizing to me, but hey, if you're hungry after 3 days of journeying down the treacherous river in this giant raft, maybe you'd want to eat a lamprey or a hagfish yourself. Not me. I'm not necessarily a big fish eater. I like the occasional cod or flounder, but lamprey, hagfish, eels, I don't think so. But hey, some people like them. So the first group, once again, are the jawless fish. It brings us to the second group. Oh, this looks like Jaws. In fact, if you look in the mouth of Jaws, you will notice a couple of former students that have been consumed by Jaws there. But sharks are certainly the most famous example of the second group called cartilaginous fish. Cartilaginous fish. Now, the deal with cartilaginous fish is that they have no bones, and you'll notice I put that in quotes because their bones have not calcified like our bones. Our bones are hard and somewhat brittle. Maybe some of you have broken bones. I know I have. In addition to my tailbone, I've broken other bones like my finger bone, toes, my nose. I broke my nose once. Oh my goodness, it's still maybe a little bit crooked there. Speaking of your nose, by the way, how many of you can wiggle your nose? Take your nose right now and wiggle the end of your nose back and forth. Or if you don't want to touch your nose, wiggle your ears back and forth. Do you know what that material is? It's cartilage. Cartilage is soft, flexible material that provides structure. In our bodies, we've got cartilage in various places, but our nose and our ears, good example of cartilage. With cartilaginous fish, however, their entire skeletons are made of cartilage. Their entire skeletons are made of cartilage. Sharks and rays are examples of cartilaginous fish. Now, I've never gone deep sea fishing. I've gone fishing in streams, rivers, and lakes. I've never gone deep sea fishing, although I'm not opposed to it. I think it would be kind of fun, actually. But if you've ever gone deep sea fishing or ever seen someone go deep sea fishing, and I have seen people do it, I used to live on the beach. If you catch a shark and you reel it in and you put it on the deck of the boat, its body kind of flattens down quite a bit relative to how its body is in the water because the weight of gravity, when it's not supported or buoyed up by the water, it flattens out because it doesn't have a hard skeleton. Its skeleton is cartilaginous, and that cartilaginous skeleton makes its body, well, somewhat flexible. So some examples of cartilaginous fish, again, include sharks and rays. Now, another interesting thing about sharks is that they actually reproduce internally, which is unlike most other fish. Most other fish reproduce externally to the body, but sharks actually reproduce internally. It's kind of an interesting characteristic. Maybe we'll explore that concept a little bit later on. And you may also have heard it said, and it is true, that sharks must be in constant motion in order to breathe. If a shark stops in water and the water isn't flowing over their bodies, they will suffocate to death. They will not be able to extract enough dissolved oxygen from the water through their gill slits in order to stay alive. So they must be in constant motion so their gill slits can extract enough oxygen to breathe. I was watching a trivia show the other night, and there was a question about if you were ever in a situation where a shark is attacking you, what should you do? Should you play dead or poke it in its eyes? Do you know what you would do? Don't play dead, because it'll just eat you up. You should poke it in its eyes. I thought, ooh, that's kind of gross. But I can imagine if I were in that situation, I might want to poke it in its eyes, but I'd probably punch its nose first, because its nose is a lot closer than its eyes. I don't think I'd want to reach as close to his eyes. It might bite my arm off. But hey, if you could give the shark a big hug and close its gills in, put your arms around the gills, you would be suffocating that shark. So maybe that would be another technique of getting away from a shark as well. Try and suffocate it by giving it a hug. Actually, I just hope I'm never in a situation where I'm actually that close to a shark, because I think I wouldn't have to worry about what to do, because I'd end up having a heart attack and dying, and the shark would just eat me anyway. But at least I wouldn't know about it. All right, let's move on to the next group of fish, and that are bony fish, or that is the bony fish group. The bony fish are probably the group that we are all most familiar with. We live in a township right next to the Pequest River here, and so some of you might even look forward to the first day of fishing season. I know I actually look forward to the first day of fishing season. I don't go fishing that much anymore. I used to when I was younger, but I look forward to the first day of fishing season now, because I know that winter is over. And this has been a brutal winter of snow and ice. And quite honestly, my body is tired, exhausted, and sore from all of the shoveling. So I'm looking forward to the first day of fishing season this year, because it'll be springtime. But many, if not all of us, are familiar with bony fish. And as the name implies, bony fish have skeletons that are made of bones, similar to our bones. And by the way, do any of you recognize the type of fish this is? I'll give you a hint. They are raised in the famous hatchery right upstream from us, the Pequest Fish Hatchery, which is the state's trout hatchery. Yes, this is a trout, and that hatchery raises brown trout, rainbow trout, and brown trout, rainbow trout. What's a third type of trout? 3 types of trout. Third. Tell you what, I'll give you a bonus point if you can email me the name of the third type of trout raised at the Pequest Fish Hatchery. So, trout and perch, 2 famous examples of bony fish that you might be familiar with. If you've ever gone fishing in a pond, you've probably caught perch or sunfish, another example of bony fish. And bony fish have a swim bladder. And a swim bladder, as you're writing that down, a swim bladder is an internal structure within the fish that controls the depth of the fish using gases, in a way very similar to how submarines can go up and down in the water. In fact, one of our activities on Thursday will involve making and using a swim bladder in the lab. It's actually a pretty cool device, and we'll get a chance to play around with swim bladders. But if you notice, an actual swim bladder in a fish, and you can see the diagram here of a fish which has been dissected open, illustrating the area or showing the area of this bag-like structure, and that's what it is. A bladder is a type of bag, and it is filled with gases. Primarily in fish, it's filled with carbon dioxide gas, the waste gas that fish get rid of. And here is a swim bladder taken out of fish, and it's kind of like a balloon. And if the balloon is squished together, there are fewer gases inside, and it will make the fish sink. If the fish allows the swim bladder to expand more, then the fish will rise in the water. Now, I'll give you an example of how you've probably experienced this in your own lives. I know we're not fish, but maybe some of you love the water and love to swim in the water and are like a fish in the water. If you've ever gone swimming in a pool, perhaps, maybe with friends, maybe you've tried to swim underwater. And you may notice that it's a little bit difficult to swim down deep when you have a lung full of air, because the air causes you to be buoyant and you rise to the surface of the water, which isn't a bad thing, by the way. okay? Maybe some of you have had contests in a pool, like, hey, who can sit at the bottom of the pool longest? Well, in order to do that contest, if you've ever done it, you know what you need to do. You need to blow the air out of your lungs so that your lungs are not filled with gases, but are rather empty, and it causes your body to sink in the water. Now, obviously, you don't want to do that for too long, because if you take a deep breath in while you're under the water, that's called drowning, and we don't want that to happen to you. So you always want to swim to the top before you take a big, deep breath of air to refill your lungs, and then you can float on the top once again. But the point is, it's very similar to how a swim bladder on a bony fish works. All right, let's move on to the next group here, amphibians. I'm a Caribbean amphibian. I love to play in the tropical sea. Hello there, Kermit the Frog here. It's not easy being green. I wish I had my Kermit home with me right now. I have Kermit in school, but I'm making this video at home. Maybe in school I'll show you how Kermit the Frog sings to us. But Kermit the Frog is an example of an amphibian. And I'm going to have you watch a little video on amphibians when this lesson is over. But amphibians, let's talk about amphibians in general terms here. Let's dissect the word amphibian. Amphibian. Being, the second part of that word relates to B-I-O. Adding an A-N at the end simply makes it an adjective. But B-I-O, not B-O, we all know what that is. B-I-O. Do any of you recall what B-I-O in biology is the study of? Life or living things. So bio means life or living thing. Amphi, what in the world does that mean? Well, maybe, have any of you ever taken a duck tour? You know how much I love ducks, but that's not kind of duck I'm talking about. Big cities like Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, many big cities that are near the water will often have duck tours. And these duck tours are involved in climbing aboard a vehicle that has wheels and a propeller, because they are amphibious vehicles. Amphibious vehicles can drive on the land and travel in the water as well. They have the best of both worlds. There was an amphibious vehicle that James Bond once drove in one of the early Bond movies. But amphi means both. And so the word amphibian means both lives. Amphibians live a double life, like a spy, like James Bond. Now, this double life involves part of its life in the water, part of its life on land. And so some of the characteristics of amphibians include the fact that amphibians are aquatic when they are young, and they use gills to breathe. They have gills like fish. So here's an example of an amphibian in a younger life stage. This is a tadpole or pollywog, and it looks more like a fish. There are no arms or legs, and it breathes with gills like fish do. But that's only half the story of an amphibian, because amphibians become terrestrial, which means living on the land, and they use their lungs when they become adults. So frogs, when they mature, they grow their arms and their legs, and they have lungs, and they can breathe air outside the water. Now, kind of another interesting characteristic that you don't have to write down, but regarding frogs here is that frogs and many other amphibians as well, they have lots of glands in their skin which enable them to also breathe through their skin in addition to their lungs through their mouths, which is why if you have a pet frog, you really shouldn't play with it or pet it too much, because if you dry out its skin, you're basically smothering it with love. Drying out the skin can cause it not to get enough oxygen in its body, and it could suffocate. All right, another characteristic. Let's move on here. Characteristic of amphibians is that they undergo metamorphosis. And metamorphosis is the name for that change that takes place between the aquatic phase and the terrestrial phase of its life. And as I mentioned before, their skin has many glands, and these glands in their skin enable them to also breathe through their skin in addition to breathing through their lungs when they are adults. Because their lungs are not really fully developed like a mammal's lungs are. So they still depend upon a damp environment and certainly damp skin. And finally, another characteristic of amphibians is that they do not have scales or claws, as we will see tomorrow distinguishes it between amphibians and reptiles. So let's finish up today with the three types of amphibians. First, we have the one that's probably most familiar to most people, the frogs and toads. Frogs and toads are amphibians. And what are some differences between frogs and toads? Well, frogs generally, even as adults, they need to live near moist environments in order to survive. Toads typically can live in drier areas and not necessarily be near an immediate water source. Toads also appear differently. Generally speaking, toads are the ones that have big bumps on them. And it's not really true that if you touch a toad, you're going to get warts. You don't have to worry about that. But one thing you might need to worry about if you pick up an American toad, which are really common in these parts in the woods, they might pee on you. So you may not get warts, but you may get peed on. And by the way, when a toad pees on you, these amphibians, they only have one opening called the cloaca, which eliminates both the liquid and the solid material from the same opening. So in addition to getting liquid waste squirted on your hand, you may also get the solid waste at the same time. So let that be a precursor of knowledge to you if you ever want to pick up toads in the woods. All right, next group are the salamanders and the newts. One primary difference between salamanders and newts salamanders do prefer newts do prefer more aquatic environments. Salamanders can get a little bit further away from the water, but there are other differences as well. We're not going to get into specific differences, but salamanders and newts, second type of amphibians, which brings us to the third type of amphibians, which are the most unfamiliar kind. They are the legless amphibians. These are really interesting critters. In fact, I'm going to give you a bonus point this week if you can give me the name of a legless amphibian. And so on that challenge for this week, I will call it quits for today. And tomorrow we will finish up our notes by talking about reptiles and birds. But for now, be sure you go back and study this information we learned today about fish and amphibians. And so until tomorrow, I'll say, bye-bye.